The handcuffs bit into her wrists as blood trickled down her temple, but Eleanor Carter stood tall despite her 78 years. Officer Blake Miller sneered, unaware that the elderly black woman he'd just struck with his baton was one of the most powerful judges in America, a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. This is the story of how one traffic stop exposed the rot at the heart of American policing. Stay with me until the end to witness justice served cold, and comment your city below. I want to know how far this story reaches. The cemetery gates closed behind Eleanor Carter's black Lincoln town car as dusk painted the Maryland sky in shades of purple and gold. She drove slowly, carefully, the way she'd done everything for the past 78 years, with deliberate precision and unwavering dignity. The fresh roses she'd left on Marcus's grave still lingered in her mind, their crimson petals a stark contrast to the cold granite that bore her husband's name. Marcus Carter, 1944-2023. Beloved husband, father, and civil rights attorney. 1 year. It had been exactly 1 year since the cancer took him, and Eleanor still found herself reaching for his hand in the passenger seat. Still caught herself setting 2 cups for morning coffee. Still heard his voice in the quiet moments between heartbeats. The Supreme Court had offered her leave, of course, compassionate leave they'd called it, but work was all that kept her anchored now. The law had been their shared passion, their battlefield, their sanctuary. Without Marcus, it was all she had left. The radio hummed softly, NPR discussing her recent dissent in Morrison versus State of Texas, though the host didn't know she was listening. They never did. Eleanor Carter had spent her entire career being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed, until the moment she spoke from the bench. Then they listened. Then they had no choice. She turned onto Maple Avenue, the familiar route home etched into muscle memory. The street was quiet for a Thursday evening, most of the suburban families already tucked inside their colonial homes, porch lights beginning to flicker on against the approaching darkness. Eleanor's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modest 2-story that she and Marcus had bought 40 years ago when the neighborhood had been less welcoming to black families. They'd endured the cold shoulders, the suspicious glances, the random property inspections, and slowly, grudgingly, they'd earned their place. Or so she'd thought. The first flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror made her heart skip, not from fear, but from that instinctive tightening that every black American knew, that genetic memory of danger passed down through generations. Eleanor checked her speedometer 32 in a 35 zone. Her registration was current inspection sticker valid. Until next month, taillights functioning. She'd checked them herself last week, a habit Marcus had insisted on. Never give them a reason, he'd always said. Not even a broken taillight. She pulled over immediately, choosing a well-lit section near the Starbucks where witnesses would be present. Her hands moved to the steering wheel, 10 and 2, visible and still. The movements were automatic, rehearsed, a deadly ballet that black parents taught their children before they taught them to tie their shoes. The cruiser door slammed with unnecessary force. In her side mirror, Eleanor watched Officer Blake Miller approach his hand, already resting on his holstered weapon. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of aggressive swagger that suggested he'd been the high school bully who'd found a legal way to continue the tradition. His uniform was crisp badge polished to a mirror shine, the kind of officer who cared more about appearance than service. Eleanor rolled down her window before he reached it, another practiced move to avoid sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice carrying the same measured authority she used when addressing counsel from the bench. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Miller bent down, his face too close to the window, invading her space with deliberate intimidation. His breath smelled of coffee and something sour, maybe energy drinks. His eyes were cold, scanning her interior, with the predetermined conclusion of guilt. "License and registration," he said, ignoring her question. "Of course. I'm going to reach for my purse now, which is on the passenger seat." Eleanor narrated her movements, another survival tactic. She retrieved her documents slowly, deliberately, and handed them through the window. Miller snatched them, roughly studying her federal judge identification with obvious skepticism. His eyebrows rose mockingly. "Eleanor Carter," he read aloud, his tone dripping condescension. "And this says you're a federal judge." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "That's a new one. Where'd you get this fake ID, internet? Officer, that identification is genuine. I'm a justice of the United States Supreme Court. You can verify. Step out of the vehicle." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities, calculating risks and outcomes with the same analytical precision she applied to constitutional law. She could refuse cite the lack of probable cause, but she knew how that story ended for people who looked like her. She could comply, hope for rationality to prevail, but the officer's eyes told her that ship had already sailed. "Officer Miller," she said, reading his nameplate, "I'm asking you respectfully to please explain the reason for this stop." "I have rights. I said, get out of the car." His hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it, but making the threat clear. "Now." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt, not from fear, but from rage, carefully controlled through decades of practice. She'd stood before the highest court in the land, had shaped the very laws this young fool was sworn to uphold, and yet here she was, reduced to her skin color, on a suburban street. She opened the door slowly, her arthritis protesting as she stood. She was dressed conservatively, as always, a navy blue suit that had cost more than Miller probably made in a month, sensible heels, her late mother's pearl necklace. The uniform of respectability that was supposed to protect her, that her generation had believed would shield their children and grandchildren from this exact moment. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle." "Officer, this is unnecessary. If you would just—" Miller grabbed her shoulder, spinning her roughly against the car. Eleanor's hip struck the doorframe, sending a spike of pain through her joints. She bit back a cry, refusing to give him the satisfaction. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I am a sitting Supreme Court justice. This stop is unlawful and—" "Sure you are," Miller sneered. "And I'm the president. Hands behind your back." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists, tightened beyond necessity. Eleanor had reviewed hundreds of cases involving excessive force, had written opinions on the reasonable use of restraints, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The helplessness, the dehumanization, the casual cruelty of it all. A small crowd had begun to gather outside the Starbucks. She could see phones raised, recording, and felt a mixture of humiliation and hope. Evidence, witnesses, the tools of justice in the digital age. "Please," a young woman called out. "She's not resisting. Why are you arresting her?" Miller turned toward the crowd. "Back up, all of you. This is police business." "I'm recording this," a teenage boy announced, his phone held high. "This is wrong, man. She didn't do nothing. She's old enough to be your grandmother," an older man added, his voice thick with disgust. Miller's face reddened. He yanked Eleanor away from her car, causing her to stumble. Her knee gave out, the bad one, the one she'd had replaced 5 years ago, and she fell forward. Instead of catching her, Miller let her drop her shoulder, hitting the asphalt hard. "Resisting arrest," he announced loudly, clearly performing for the cameras now. "Stop resisting." Eleanor hadn't moved, couldn't move with her hands cuffed behind her and her shoulder screaming in pain. But Miller grabbed her anyway, hauling her up roughly. That's when she made her mistake. She turned her head to look at him, to meet his eyes, with the full weight of her dignity intact. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly, not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Miller's baton was in his hand before she saw him reach for it. The strike caught her across the temple, not hard enough to knock her unconscious, but enough to split the skin. Blood ran warm down her face, dropping onto her suit jacket, her mother's pearls. The crowd erupted. Shouts of outrage, disgust, horror. More phones appeared, the modern witnesses to injustice. But Miller didn't care. He was beyond caring, lost in the intoxication of his own power. "Threatening an officer," he said loudly. "You all heard her threaten me." "That wasn't a threat," the young woman from before shouted. "You just assaulted her. What's wrong with you?" Miller dragged Eleanor toward his cruiser, her legs barely supporting her weight now. The blood from her temple had reached her collar, staining the white silk beneath her jacket. She thought absurdly of her dry cleaner, Mrs. Park, who would tisk disapprovingly at the stain, would work her magic to save the suit, because she knew Eleanor had worn it for Marcus's funeral. As Miller shoved her into the back of the cruiser, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the window's reflection, blood on her face, hair disheveled, dignity stripped away layer by layer. She thought of all the cases she'd presided over, all the police testimony she'd weighed, all the careful balances she'd struck between law enforcement needs and civil liberties. How naive she'd been, she realized, to think the law could protect everyone equally when it couldn't even protect her. The drive to the station was short, barely 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Miller had the radio turned up, some talk show host ranting about crime rates and the need for tougher policing. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. She pressed her face against the cool window, watching familiar streets pass by, wondering if any of her neighbors would see her in the back of a police car and what they would think. The respectability she'd spent a lifetime building shattered in an instant by one man's prejudice and a system that enabled it. Miller kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, perhaps beginning to sense that something was off. Eleanor carried herself differently than his usual arrests. Even bloodied and handcuffed, there was an authority to her that couldn't quite be extinguished. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't rage. She simply observed, cataloging every detail with the trained eye of someone who had spent 50 years in courtrooms. "You know," Miller said, his bravado slightly diminished, "if you really are some kind of judge, you should know better than to resist arrest." Eleanor didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words, that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent fill the void with their own mistakes. "I mean, a fake federal ID, that's serious stuff. That's federal crime territory right there." He was talking himself up now, justifying what he'd done. "You're looking at real time for impersonating a federal official." Still, Eleanor said nothing. She thought instead of her colleagues on the court, wondered if they'd heard yet. Chief Justice Robertson would be furious, not just at the assault on a fellow justice, but at the institutional disrespect it represented. Justice Chen would probably cry. She was young, still idealistic enough to be shocked by injustice. And Justice Thompson. Thompson would want blood. The old Texas prosecutor in him would demand nothing less than Miller's complete destruction. The police station loomed ahead, a squat brick building that Eleanor had driven past 1,000 times without really seeing. Now it seemed ominous, its windows like dead eyes, its entrance a mouth ready to swallow what remained of her dignity. Miller parked and came around to extract her from the back seat. The handcuffs had cut off circulation to her fingers, making them numb and clumsy. She stumbled, getting out, and Miller grabbed her arm again, his fingers digging into the bruises he'd already created. Inside the station was exactly what she'd expected. Fluorescent lights that turned everything sickly green, the smell of burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, the constant noise of radios and phones and human misery. The booking area was crowded, a typical Thursday night collection of DUI's domestic disputes and petty crimes. "Got a live one here," Miller announced to the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Kowalski, according to his nameplate. Fake federal ID resisting arrest threatening an officer. Kowalski looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening slightly, at Eleanor's appearance, the blood, the expensive suit, the age. "Jesus, Miller, what the hell?" "She fell," Miller said quickly. "Resisted arrest, tried to run." Eleanor finally spoke. "That's a lie, and there are multiple witnesses with video evidence to prove it." Her voice cut through the noise of the station like a blade. Several officers turned to look, something in her tone commanding attention. Kowalski stood up, coming around the desk. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I need you to call Chief Justice Robertson of the United States Supreme Court," Eleanor said calmly. "His direct number is 202-555-1789. Tell him Justice Carter has been assaulted and unlawfully detained." The station went quiet. Someone dropped a coffee mug, the crash echoing in the sudden silence. Miller laughed, but it sounded forced now. "She's delusional. Probably mentally ill. We should get her a psych evaluation." Kowalski was studying Eleanor more carefully, now taking in details Miller had missed or ignored: the quality of her suit, the Harvard class ring on her finger, the way she held herself despite the circumstances. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. "Justice Eleanor Marie Carter. I was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Harrison in 2015. My confirmation hearing was chaired by Senator Williams. I wrote the majority opinion in Brady v. Coleman, which every officer in this room should have studied in their training on Fourth Amendment rights." She fixed Kowalski with a steady gaze. "Now are you going to make that call, or should I wait for my attorneys to do it for you?" Kowalski's face had gone pale. He grabbed the phone, then hesitated. "The Chief Justice's direct line, 202-555-1789, Eleanor repeated. "Tell him it's code black. He'll understand." As Kowalski dialed with shaking fingers, Miller grabbed Eleanor's arm again. "This is bullshit. She's playing you all. No way a Supreme Court justice is driving alone through our jurisdiction." "My husband is buried at Riverside Cemetery," Eleanor said quietly. "I visit him every Thursday. I live at 428 Maple Avenue in the house we bought in 1983. I shop at the Giant on Connecticut Avenue. I get my coffee from the same Starbucks where your assault on me was witnessed and recorded by at least a dozen people." The phone conversation was brief. Kowalski's face went from pale to ashen as he listened to whoever was on the other end. He hung up and immediately turned to another officer. "Get the captain, now, and call an ambulance." "What?" Miller protested. "Sarge, come on." "Shut up, Miller." Kowalski's voice was sharp with barely controlled panic. "Just shut your mouth before you make this any worse." Captain David Russell arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd served in the military before joining the force. He took one look at Eleanor, at the blood still drying on her face, at the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, and his expression went from confusion to horror. "Get those cuffs off her immediately," he barked. Miller fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking now as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. The cuffs came off, and Eleanor's hands fell to her sides, numb and useless. She flexed her fingers slowly, painfully, feeling returning in pins and needles. "Justice Carter," Russell said, his voice carefully controlled. "I am so deeply sorry. There are no words. The Chief Justice is on his way, as is the FBI. An ambulance should be here any moment." The FBI, Miller's voice cracked. Why would assaulting a federal judge is a federal crime? Eleanor said, speaking directly to Miller for the first time since entering the station. Particularly when that assault is motivated by racial prejudice, as the videos will clearly show. The station erupted into controlled chaos. Officers scrambled to secure the scene to locate and preserve all evidence. Someone brought Eleanor a chair, another a bottle of water, a third, a clean towel for her head. She accepted it all with grace even as her body began to shake, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally leaving her system. Miller stood frozen in the middle of it all, watching his world collapse in real time. His fellow officers avoided his eyes, stepping around him like he was already a ghost. The Brotherhood in Blue had its limits, and assaulting a Supreme Court justice was apparently one of them. Eleanor watched him with something almost like pity. He was so young, so stupid, so absolutely certain of his own power, until the moment it evaporated. She'd seen it before in different contexts, CEOs who thought themselves untouchable until the indictments came down, politicians who believed their own invincibility until the votes were counted. Power was always an illusion borrowed from systems and structures that could revoke it in an instant. The ambulance arrived, EMTs rushing in with their equipment. They were gentle, professional, treating her with the care reserved for someone important. It shouldn't have mattered, Eleanor thought. They should treat everyone with this same consideration, whether they were a justice or a janitor. But that was the very heart of the problem, wasn't it? The selective application of humanity based on perceived worth. As they cleaned the wound on her temple, checking for signs of concussion, Eleanor heard the commotion outside. The press had arrived. Somehow they always did, drawn to scandal like moths to flame. She could hear the shouted questions, see the camera flashes through the windows. By morning, her bloodied face would be on every front page in the country. Justice Carter, Russell said, hovering nervously nearby. Is there anything we can do, anyone we can call? My son, Eleanor said. Michael Carter. He's a partner at Williams & Associates. She gave him the number, knowing Michael would drop. Everything would probably break several traffic laws getting there. Her daughter Sarah was in Seattle, but she'd be on the next flight once she heard. The EMTs wanted to transport her to the hospital, but Eleanor refused. Not yet, she said. Not until this is properly documented. She stood slowly, painfully, but under her own power. The assembled officers watched as she straightened her jacket, touched her mother's pearls, to ensure they were still there, and raised her chin with the dignity that Miller had tried and failed to steal. Captain Russell, she said, her voice carrying the authority of the bench despite the blood on her face. I want every piece of evidence preserved, every dashcam video, every body cam, if your officers wear them, every witness statement, every photograph. I want Officer Miller's complete personnel file, including any previous complaints or disciplinary actions. I want the dispatch recordings that will show there was no legitimate reason for the stop. Russell nodded rapidly. Yes, Justice Carter. Of course. Everything. And Captain, Eleanor continued, I want it understood that this is not just about me. I have the resources to fight back the platform, to demand justice. But what about those who don't? What about the others? Officer Miller has stopped harassed, possibly assaulted. This ends here. Tonight. The captain's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Chief Justice Robertson arrived like a force of nature, his usual composed demeanor shattered by rage. He was still in his evening clothes, having clearly left some formal event the moment he got the call. Behind him came a phalanx of federal agents and prosecutors, the full weight of the justice system mobilizing to protect one of its own. Eleanor, he said, his voice soft with concern, as he took in her appearance. "My God." "I'm all right, William," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "But we have work to do." He understood immediately. This wasn't just about her, it never could be given who she was and what she represented. This was about every traffic stop that went wrong, every abuse of power, every moment when the law failed those it was meant to protect. Miller was being read his rights now, the words he'd probably recited hundreds of times being turned against him. His hands were cuffed behind his back gently. Eleanor noted with bitter irony, with none of the unnecessary tightness he'd applied to hers. He looked young and scared, all his earlier bravado evaporated. As they led him past her, he tried to speak. "Justice Carter, Save it for your lawyer," she said coldly. "You'll need a good one." The FBI agents were efficient, thorough, treating the station like a crime scene, which Eleanor supposed it was. Every officer present was interviewed, every piece of equipment examined. The videos from the witnesses' phones were already being collected and analyzed. The machine of justice, when properly motivated, could move with terrifying speed. Michael arrived just as Eleanor was finally agreeing to go to the hospital. Her son, normally so composed in his expensive suits and lawyer's demeanor, looked shattered. He crashed into her, careful of her injuries, but unable to help himself, reverting to the little boy who'd once cried in her arms over scraped knees and playground bullies. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with tears he was fighting not to shed. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault, baby," she said, using the endearment she hadn't voiced in years. "None of this is your fault." But she knew what he meant. The apology wasn't just for what had happened, but for the world that had allowed it to happen, for the progress that hadn't come fast enough, for the equality that remained just out of reach, despite all their fighting, all their achievements, all their hopes. As they walked toward the ambulance, Eleanor passed a mirror and caught sight of herself again. The blood had been cleaned away, but the wound was visible, already purpling into what would be a spectacular bruise. Her suit was ruined, her pearls spotted with blood that would never fully come out. But her eyes were clear and determined. Officer Blake Miller had made a mistake tonight. He'd pulled over the wrong car, abused the wrong woman, revealed the rot in the system to someone with the power to do something about it. He'd thought her age, her race, her gender made her weak, made her an easy target. He'd learned differently. Outside, the cameras were waiting. Eleanor could have gone out, the back avoided them, preserved what was left of her privacy. But that wasn't who she was, wasn't what this moment demanded. She walked out the front door, her son supporting her on one side, Chief Justice Robertson on the other, and faced the barrage of flashes and questions with her head held high. "Justice Carter, can you tell us what happened? Was this racially motivated? Will you be pressing charges? What does this say about police reform?" She stopped at the ambulance doors, turning to face them fully. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "Tonight, I experienced what too many Americans experience every day," she said, her voice carrying despite her exhaustion. "I was stopped without cause, brutalized without justification, and treated as less than human because of the color of my skin. The only difference between me and countless others is that I have the platform and resources to fight back." She paused, letting her words sink in, letting the cameras capture her injured face, her blood-stained suit, the dignity that couldn't be stripped away. "This is not just about me," she continued. "This is about systemic injustice that has been allowed to persist for far too long. Officer Miller will face justice, of that I can assure you. But one officer's prosecution isn't enough. We need comprehensive reform, real accountability, and a recognition that the law must protect everyone equally, or it protects no one at all." A reporter shouted a follow-up question, but Eleanor was done. She climbed into the ambulance with as much grace as her injuries allowed Michael, beside her, leaving the chaos behind. As the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, she finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, leaning against her son's shoulder. "Your father would have been proud," Michael said softly. "The way you handled that, he would have been so proud." Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking of Marcus, of all the fights they'd fought together, all the battles yet to come. "He would have been furious," she corrected. "But yes, proud too. We always knew this work wasn't finished. Tonight just proved how far we still have to go." The ambulance drove through the night toward the hospital, but Eleanor's mind was already moving beyond her own injuries to the larger fight ahead. Officer Blake Miller had thought he was pulling over just another elderly black woman, someone he could bully and demean without consequence. Instead, he'd started a reckoning that would ripple through every police department in the country. She touched her fingers to the wound on her temple, feeling the raised edges where the baton had struck. It would scar, probably a permanent reminder of this night. Good, she thought. Let it scar. Let everyone see it every time she sat on the bench, every time she delivered an opinion, every time she stood for justice. Let it be a reminder that the fight was personal, now not just professional, not just theoretical, but carved into her very skin. The hospital lights appeared ahead, and Eleanor steeled herself for what came next. The examinations, the documentation, the beginning of a legal process that would consume months, if not years, of her life. But she was ready. She'd been preparing for this fight her entire career without knowing it. Officer Blake Miller had made the worst mistake of his life tonight. He'd given Eleanor Carter, Justice Eleanor Carter, a personal stake in reforming the system that had protected him and officers like him for far too long. And Eleanor Carter didn't lose fights that mattered. As the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, surrounded immediately by hospital security and federal agents, Eleanor thought of all the unnamed victims who'd never made it this far, who'd been silenced by fear or force, or the simple exhaustion of fighting a system designed to defeat them. Tonight was for them too. Tonight was for everyone who'd been pulled over for driving, while black, who'd been told they didn't belong, who'd been reduced to stereotypes and statistics. The emergency room doors opened, bright lights flooding the ambulance interior. Eleanor squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. The physical wounds would heal, but the determination they'd awakened would not fade. Officer Blake Miller had created his own worst nightmare. A victim with power, a voice that couldn't be silenced, and the absolute conviction that justice delayed would not be justice denied. Not this time. Not anymore. The reckoning had begun. The emergency room at Georgetown Medical Center transformed into a fortress within minutes of Eleanor's arrival. Federal agents positioned themselves at every entrance, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. The usual chaos of a Thursday night ER came to an abrupt halt as staff realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary patient. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the attending physician, approached Eleanor with a mixture of professional composure and barely concealed outrage. She'd seen the news alerts already spreading across social media, grainy videos of the assault playing on loop, each viewing making her hands shake with fury. "Justice Carter, I'm Dr. Hernandez. We need to examine your injuries thoroughly. The head trauma is my primary concern, but I also want to check that shoulder and your wrists." Eleanor nodded, exhausted now that the adrenaline was fading. Michael helped her onto the examination table, his hands gentle but trembling. She could feel his rage radiating off him in waves, the controlled fury of a son who'd watched his mother brutalized and could do nothing but seek justice through the same system that had failed her. "Mrs. Carter," a young nurse began, then caught herself. "I mean Justice Carter. Eleanor is fine. she said softly, wincing as Dr. Hernandez probed the gash on her temple. This is going to need stitches, the doctor said. You're lucky a few inches lower, and we'd be dealing with potential eye damage. The orbital bone seems intact, but I want a CT scan to rule out any cranial bleeding. As they worked on her, Eleanor's phone, retrieved from her impounded car, buzzed incessantly. Sarah calling from Seattle, her colleagues from the court, senators, congressmen, civil rights leaders who'd already heard the news. Michael fielded them all, his voice professional despite the circumstances. No, Senator Williams, she can't come to the phone right now. Yes, we'll be pursuing every legal avenue. The videos speak for themselves. Chief Justice Robertson remained in the room, a silent sentinel, whose presence ensured Eleanor received the best possible care. But she could see the calculations behind his eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the integrity of the court itself, about what it meant when a sitting justice could be brutalized with impunity. William, she said, as the nurse cleaned her wrists, photographing the angry red marks left by the handcuffs. I need you to promise me something. Anything, Eleanor. Don't let them bury this. Don't let them make it go away quietly with a settlement and a sealed record. This needs to see daylight, all of it. Robertson's jaw tightened. You have my word. Miller will face the full weight of federal prosecution. Civil rights violations, assault on a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law. It's not just about Miller, Eleanor interrupted. How many complaints did he have in his file? How many times was he allowed to do this to someone who couldn't fight back? I want the entire department investigated. The DOJ is already mobilizing. By morning, that police station will be under federal oversight. The CT scan required her to be wheeled through the hospital corridors, and Eleanor saw how the other patients watched her pass, some with recognition dawning in their eyes. Others simply curious about the obvious VIP treatment. In the radiology waiting room, a young black mother with a toddler on her hip stood up suddenly. Justice Carter, she said hesitantly. Is it really you? Eleanor nodded, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. They did this to you. She shifted her child to her other hip, her free hand clenching into a fist. If they can do this to you, what chance do the rest of us have? It was the question Eleanor had been asking herself all night. She reached out, taking the woman's hand. We have the chance we make for ourselves, she said. What's your name? Denise. Denise Williams. This is my son, Marcus. Eleanor's breath caught at the name. That was my husband's name, Marcus. She looked at the little boy, maybe 3 years old, watching her with wide, curious eyes. Hi, Marcus. The boy smiled shyly, hiding his face in his mother's shoulder. I saw the video, Denise said quietly. My cousin posted it on Facebook. The way that cop hit you. She trailed off, shaking her head. My brother got pulled over last month. They made him get out, made him sit on the curb for 40 minutes while they ran his plates. He works at the Pentagon, has security clearance, but none of that mattered. Did he file a complaint? Denise laughed bitterly. Against who? The same department that investigates itself. The same chief who says there's never any wrongdoing. The radiology technician appeared ready to take Eleanor for her scan, but she held up a hand. Michael, give Ms. Williams your card. I want to hear about her brother's case. As she was wheeled away, Eleanor heard Denise whisper to her son, That's a Supreme Court justice, baby. She makes sure the laws are fair for everyone. The weight of that innocent faith followed Eleanor into the CT scanner, where she lay still in the machine's tunnel, listening to its mechanical breathing while her mind raced. How many Denises were out there? How many brothers and fathers and sons humiliated on roadsides? How many mothers teaching their children to survive encounters with those sworn to protect them? The scan was clear, no bleeding, no fractures, just soft tissue damage that would heal with time. But as Dr. Hernandez stitched the gash on her temple, Eleanor knew some wounds went deeper than bone. 12 stitches, the doctor said, tying off the last suture. It'll scar, I'm afraid. Let it, Eleanor said, meeting her own eyes in the hand mirror the nurse offered. The wound ran from her temple toward her ear, angry and red against her brown skin. Some things should leave marks. By the time they finished treating her, documenting every bruise, photographing every injury, collecting her bloodied clothes as evidence, it was nearly midnight. The hospital's administrative conference room had been commandeered as a temporary command center. FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and DOJ officials had assembled, turning the space into a war room. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Crawford, a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair, had taken charge of the criminal case. Eleanor knew him by reputation, meticulous, relentless, and absolutely ruthless when prosecuting civil rights violations. Justice Carter, he began. We've already secured all available video evidence. 17 different cell phone recordings from multiple angles. The dashcam from Miller's cruiser. Security footage from 3 nearby businesses. The case is airtight. What about Miller's history? Eleanor asked. Crawford's expression darkened. 14 complaints in 3 years. 12 of them from Black or Hispanic citizens. All ruled unsubstantiated or within department policy. He was flagged for additional training twice but never disciplined. Of course he wasn't, Michael muttered. There's more, Crawford continued. We've found a pattern. Miller specifically requested assignments in predominantly minority neighborhoods. His arrest statistics show significant racial disparities, even accounting for demographics. Eleanor felt sick. He was hunting. That's one interpretation. His defense will argue he was simply being proactive in high-crime areas. Defense, Chief Justice Robertson interjected. What possible defense could he have? He's already lawyered up. Daniel Morrison from Morrison & Associates. Eleanor knew Morrison, a showboat who specialized in defending cops accused of excessive force. He'd play to the jury's fears, paint Miller as a hero, protecting society from dangerous criminals. The fact that Eleanor was a Supreme Court justice would be twisted. Somehow she'd be portrayed as elitist, out of touch, someone who thought she was above the law. Let him try, Eleanor said coldly. I've faced better lawyers than Morrison. FBI Special Agent Diana Foster entered the room, her phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call and addressed the room. We have a situation. The protests have started. Protests? Eleanor asked. Outside the police station. Started with about 50 people an hour ago. It's over 300 now and growing. They're demanding Miller's immediate arrest and the chief's resignation. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were standing up, speaking out, demanding justice, not just for her, but for everyone who'd suffered similar treatment without the protection of high office. I need to go there, she said. The room erupted in protests. Security concerns, medical advice, legal ramifications, everyone had a reason why she shouldn't go. But Eleanor had made up her mind. They're out there for me, but more importantly, they're out there for themselves, for their own experiences. I need to stand with them. Michael understood first, as she knew he would. I'll come with you. Eleanor, Robertson said carefully. You've been through enough tonight. No one would blame you for going home recovering. That's exactly what they expect, she interrupted. For me to go home to my comfortable house, to let the system handle it quietly, to be the good victim who doesn't make waves. But that's not why Marcus and I fought all those cases, why we spent our lives in courtrooms. We did it for moments like this when staying quiet is complicity. Dr. Hernandez cleared her throat. Medically speaking, you have a concussion. You need rest. I'll rest when there's justice, Eleanor replied, then softened. I promise to take it easy, doctor. But I need to do this. The convoy that transported Eleanor to the police station looked like something out of a presidential motorcade, black SUVs with federal plates, police escorts with sirens silent, but lights flashing. As they approached, she could hear the crowd, before she saw them chanting, singing their voices, carrying old songs that she remembered from her youth, from when she and Marcus had marched for civil rights as law students. The crowd had grown to nearly 500 people. They held signs, Justice for Justice Carter, End Police Brutality, Black Lives Always Mattered. But also personal signs, pictures of loved ones who died in police custody, names of victims who never made headlines, statistics written in marker on cardboard. When Eleanor stepped out of the SUV supported by Michael, a hush fell over the crowd. Then someone started clapping, and it spread like wildfire until the applause was thunderous. But Eleanor raised her hand, and they quieted. Please, she said, her voice carrying despite her exhaustion. Don't applaud me. I survived. Too many don't. She walked toward them, her security detail scrambling to keep up. An elderly black man in a Vietnam veteran cap reached out, and she took his weathered hand in hers. My grandson, he said, tears streaming down his face. They killed my grandson 2 years ago, said he reached for something. It was his inhaler. He had asthma. Eleanor squeezed his hand, having no words that could ease such pain. A young woman pushed forward, her phone out. Justice Carter, I was at the Starbucks. I filmed it all. The way he hit you, she started crying. My mom said to never fight back, to just comply, that if we're respectful enough, we'll be safe. But you were respectful. You did everything right. What's your name? Eleanor asked. Jasmine. Jasmine Porter. Thank you for recording it, Jasmine. For bearing witness. That took courage. More people pressed forward, each with their own story, their own trauma, their own anger and grief and desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. Eleanor listened to as many as she could, her concussion making the world spin slightly, but she refused to leave. Captain Russell appeared at the station entrance, his face grim. The crowd's energy shifted immediately, angry shouts replacing the previous solidarity. Justice Carter, he called out. Could we speak privately? Eleanor looked at the crowd, then back at Russell. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. These people deserve transparency. Russell clearly hadn't expected that, but he stepped forward. Officer Miller is being processed at the Federal Detention Center. He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. The department is launching a full internal investigation. Internal? Someone shouted. You mean you're investigating yourselves again? Russell's jaw tightened. Additionally, the Department of Justice will be conducting an independent investigation. We will cooperate fully. What about his partner? Eleanor asked. Officer Miller wasn't working alone. Someone should have intervened. Officer Johnson has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The crowd erupted again, demanding more, demanding better. Eleanor saw the fear in Russell's eyes, not of physical violence, but of the reckoning that was coming. The spotlight was on his department now, and every questionable arrest, every excessive force complaint, every covered-up misconduct would be dragged into the light. A young reporter pushed through the crowd, her microphone extended. Justice Carter, do you believe this was racially motivated? Eleanor looked directly into the camera. A white police officer stopped me without cause, immediately dismissed my identification as fake, escalated to violence when I posed no threat, and struck me with a baton while I was handcuffed. If I had been a white grandmother driving home from visiting her husband's grave, Would any of that have happened? The question hung in the air, rhetorical, but demanding an answer that everyone already knew. Another reporter. Will this experience influence your judicial decisions going forward? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Every experience shapes us, but my commitment remains to the Constitution, to equal justice under law. The difference is that now I've personally experienced how far we still are from that ideal. She turned back to the crowd, seeing her younger self in their faces, the law student who'd believed justice was achievable through legislation and litigation, who'd thought that changing laws would change hearts. She still believed in the law, but now understood its limitations more clearly than ever. Change doesn't come from above, she told them. It comes from people like you standing up, speaking out, refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Keep protesting, keep recording, keep demanding better. The law is only as strong as the people's will to enforce it fairly. Michael touched her elbow gently. Mom, you're swaying. He was right. The concussion was asserting itself, the world tilting slightly. But she had one more thing to do. Captain Russell, she called out. I want to see where Officer Miller processed his arrests. I want to see the holding cells where he brought the people he stopped. Russell looked like he wanted to refuse, but how could he? Of course, Justice Carter. This way. The processing area was exactly as depressing as Eleanor expected. Harsh fluorescent lights, concrete walls painted institutional beige, the lingering smell of fear and despair. The holding cells were small, meant for temporary detention, but she knew people sometimes spent days here waiting for transfer or release. How many people did Officer Miller arrest this month? She asked. Russell consulted with a sergeant who pulled up records on a computer. 43 arrests. Demographics. The sergeant's fingers clicked across keys. 38 black, 4 Hispanic, 1 white. And the white arrest, more clicking. DUI. The suspect struck another vehicle. So the only white person Miller arrested was someone who literally couldn't be ignored. Eleanor felt the weight of those statistics, each number representing a person, a family, a community traumatized. She walked to one of the holding cells, placing her hand on the bars. How many innocents had stood here? How many had been guilty of nothing more than being the wrong color in the wrong place? The metal was cold under her palm, worn smooth by countless hands over the years. I want the records of every arrest Officer Miller ever made, she said. Every complaint, every use of force report, every dashcam video. All of it. That's hundreds of files, Russell said. Then you'd better start gathering them. As they walked back through the station, Eleanor noticed the other officers watching her, some with hostility, seeing her as a threat to their brotherhood. Others with what might have been shame, recognizing that their silence had enabled Miller's actions. And a few, just a few, with something like hope, as if her presence might finally bring the change they'd been afraid to push for themselves. Outside, the crowd had grown larger still. Someone had brought candles, and they flickered in the darkness like stars brought down to earth. A minister was leading a prayer, his voice rolling over the assembled masses, with the cadence of generations of struggle and survival. Eleanor stood with them for a moment, more adding her voice to their prayers, before Michael finally insisted on taking her home. As their convoy pulled away, she watched the protesters in the rear window, still standing, still singing, still demanding justice. The ride to her house was quiet, except for the low murmur of the federal agents' radios. Michael held her hand, and Eleanor was transported back decades to when he was small and would grip her fingers during thunderstorms, seeking comfort. Now he was the one providing it, the child becoming the protector. Her house looked different somehow when they arrived. The same brick facade, the same neat lawn. Marcus had taken such pride in maintaining the same porch light she always left on. But now it felt exposed, vulnerable. The illusion of safety that came with success and position had been shattered. She was just another black woman in America, and no amount of achievement could fully protect her from that reality. Inside, Michael helped her to the couch, while the federal agents did a security sweep standard procedure. They said, though, Eleanor wondered if it would ever feel standard to have armed guards in her home. On the mantel, photographs chronicled a life of accomplishment: her law school graduation, her swearing in as a federal judge, her Supreme Court investiture pictures with presidents and dignitaries. But tonight, they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. "You should eat something," Michael said, moving toward the kitchen. "I'm not hungry." "Mom, please. You need to keep your strength up." She heard Marcus in his voice, then the same gentle insistence her husband had used when she'd get too absorbed in a case to remember meals. The grief hit her fresh, wishing desperately that Marcus was here to hold her, to tell her they'd get through this together as they'd gotten through everything else. The doorbell rang, and every agent in the house tensed. One checked the security monitor, then relaxed slightly. "It's Justice Thompson and Justice Chen, ma'am." Eleanor hadn't expected them, but she shouldn't have been surprised. The court was nothing if not collegial, and an attack on one was an attack on all. She nodded, and the agents let them in. Justice Robert Thompson entered first, his usual commanding presence somehow even more intense. The former Texas prosecutor looked ready to personally prosecute Miller himself. Behind him, Justice Lisa Chen carried a basket that undoubtedly contained food. She was infamous for believing that all crises could be improved with proper nutrition. "Eleanor," Thompson said, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw the videos. I want 5 minutes alone with that son of a—" Robert Chen interrupted gently, then turned to Eleanor. "How are you really not the brave face you're putting on for everyone else?" Eleanor let the facade drop for just a moment. "I'm tired, Lisa. So deeply tired. Not just from tonight, but from all of it. From spending my whole life proving I belong in spaces that were never designed for me, only to be reminded that to some people I'll never be anything more than—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Chen sat beside her, taking her hand. "You're Eleanor Carter. You're a brilliant jurist, a loving mother, a fierce advocate for justice. And yes, you're a black woman in America with all the weight that carries. All of those things are true at once." Thompson paced the room like a caged lion. "The chief wants to call an emergency conference tomorrow. Address this publicly, show solidarity." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't have the court turned into a political circus. This isn't about the institution, it's about the systematic—" Her phone rang, the caller ID showing Sarah's face. Her daughter had been calling repeatedly, but Eleanor hadn't been ready to talk to her yet. This time she answered. "Mom." Sarah's voice was thick with tears. "I'm at the airport. I'll be there by morning. Mom, I saw God. I saw what He did to you." "I'm all right, baby." "No, you're not. Don't do that. Don't pretend this is okay." Eleanor closed her eyes, hearing the fierce protectiveness in her daughter's voice. Sarah had inherited Marcus's intensity, his inability to let injustice stand. "You're right," she admitted. "It's not okay. But I'm safe now. I've been on the phone with the Seattle chapter of the ACLU. They want to help with the civil suit. Mom, we're going to destroy him and the entire department." Eleanor felt a flutter of pride despite everything. Both her children had become fighters in their own ways, carrying on the work she and Marcus had started. After Sarah hung up with promises to text when she landed, Eleanor realized the room had filled with more people. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had somehow gotten past the federal agents with a pot of soup. The Reverend James Morrison from the church she occasionally attended sat quietly in the corner, his presence a comfort even without words. Her former clerk, now a federal judge himself, stood by the window, tears running down his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen to you," he said. "You're supposed to be protected. You're supposed to be—" "Above it all," Eleanor finished gently, "no one is David. That's what we need to understand. No amount of success, no title, no position puts us above the reach of prejudice." The night wore on, people coming and going, each offering support in their own way. The U.S. Attorney General called personally, promising the full resources of the Justice Department. Several senators released statements condemning the attack. The Congressional Black Caucus announced they would be calling for immediate hearings on police reform. But it was the smaller gestures that touched Eleanor most. The text from her dry cleaner saying she'd replace the ruined suit free of charge. The email from a law student she'd mentored years ago, now a civil rights attorney in Chicago, offering to fly in and help with the case. The voicemail from the Starbucks barista who'd witnessed the attack, crying as she apologized for not doing more to help. As midnight passed into the early hours of morning, the house finally quieted. Michael had fallen asleep in Marcus's old recliner, exhaustion overtaking his vigilance. The federal agents maintained their posts, shadows moving occasionally past the windows. Eleanor sat alone in her study, surrounded by law books that had been her life's work. Each one representing cases argued precedents set, justice pursued, if not always achieved. She opened her laptop and began to write. Not a legal brief or judicial opinion, but something more personal. A statement that would be released in the morning, but more than that, a testimony to what had happened and what it meant. "Tonight," she wrote, "I experienced what too many Americans face daily, the weaponization of law enforcement against those it should protect. I was stopped without cause, assaulted without provocation, and detained without justification. My crime, driving while black. My punishment, violence and humiliation. My privilege, surviving to tell about it." She continued writing, the words flowing like blood from a wound, necessary and painful and cleansing. She wrote about Marcus, about their shared dream of a more just society. She wrote about her children, the world she wanted to leave them. She wrote about Denise Williams and her son in the hospital waiting room, about the veteran who'd lost his grandson, about Jasmine Porter, who'd had the courage to record injustice. "This is not about one racist cop," she wrote. "This is about a system that protects and enables racist cops. This is about qualified immunity that shields brutality. This is about internal investigations that always find no wrongdoing. This is about a culture that sees black bodies as threats rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect." As dawn began to lighten the sky outside her window, Eleanor heard movement in the house. Sarah had arrived, her voice mixing with Michael's in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. A new day was beginning, and with it the fight for justice would intensify. Eleanor saved her statement and closed the laptop. She touched the bandage on her temple, feeling the stitches underneath. In a few hours, she would face cameras again, would begin the long process of seeking justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been silenced. Officer Blake Miller would be arraigned, would plead not guilty, would try to justify his actions. The system would grind forward, slow and imperfect, but inexorable. But for now, in these quiet moments before the storm resumed, Eleanor allowed herself to grieve for the innocence lost, for the safety that had always been an illusion, for the country that still had so far to go. She thought of Marcus, wondered what he would say, and heard his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "Keep fighting, Elle. Always keep fighting." The The sun rose over Maryland, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in a federal detention center, Officer Blake Miller was waking up to his first day as a defendant rather than an enforcer. Somewhere, protesters were preparing for another day of demonstrations. Somewhere, other officers were putting on their badges and guns, and Eleanor could only hope that at least some of them would remember what happened when power was abused, when authority became tyranny, when the wrong person was pushed too far. The federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore had never seen such a crowd for an arraignment. By 7 in the morning, 3 hours before Officer Blake Miller was scheduled to appear, the steps were already packed with protesters, media trucks, and a heavy police presence that seemed ironic given the circumstances. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as the news helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trained on the growing assembly. Sarah stood behind her, braiding her mother's gray hair, with gentle fingers, careful to avoid the bandaged area. It was something she'd done as a child, a morning ritual when Eleanor had important cases. The familiar touch grounded Eleanor, reminded her that she was more than just a victim or a symbol. She was a mother, a woman with a life that extended beyond this moment of crisis. "You don't have to go," Sarah said quietly. "Crawford can handle the arraignment without you there." Eleanor reached up to pat her daughter's hand. "Yes, I do. Miller needs to see me there. More importantly, everyone else needs to see that I'm not hiding, not broken." Michael entered with a garment bag. "Mom, there's something you should see first." He turned on the television where the morning news was covering the story wall to wall. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Across the country, other victims were coming forward with their own stories about Officer Miller and others like him. A young man in Baltimore was showing reporters the scar on his shoulder where Miller had allegedly used excessive force during a traffic stop 2 years ago. His complaint had been dismissed as unsubstantiated. A mother in the suburbs held up a picture of her teenage son, describing how Miller had held him at gunpoint for matching the description of a suspect who turned out to be 20 years older and 50 pounds heavier. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of abuse that was finally being unwoven. "Justice Carter's assault has opened the floodgates," the reporter was saying. "What was once dismissed as isolated incidents now appears to be a pattern of racial profiling and excessive force that spans years." Eleanor's phone rang. It was Crawford, the federal prosecutor. "Justice Carter, there's been a development. Miller's attorney is already floating the idea of a plea deal." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said immediately. "No deals. This goes to trial. I understand your position, but I should warn you, Morrison is going to make this ugly. He's already suggesting that you were belligerent, that you pulled rank, that Miller felt threatened by your supposed political connections." Eleanor laughed bitterly. A 78-year-old woman with arthritis made him feel threatened. Let him try that defense in front of a jury. She hung up and turned to her children. "They're going to try to destroy me. You both need to be prepared for that. Every case I've ever decided, every opinion I've written, every aspect of our lives will be scrutinized." "Let them," Sarah said fiercely. "We have nothing to hide." The drive to the courthouse was surreal. Their convoy moved through streets lined with people holding signs of support. Eleanor saw her own face on posters alongside the faces of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and too many others. She wasn't comfortable with the comparison. She had survived after all, but understood that her assault had become a flashpoint for long simmering rage. Inside the courthouse, the halls were packed, despite security's attempts at crowd control. Eleanor was ushered into a private witness room where Crawford waited with his team. "Morrison's here," he said. "He's been grandstanding to the media, claiming this is a witch hunt, that Miller is being scapegoated for doing his job." Through the window, Eleanor could see the defense table where Miller sat in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished without his uniform and badge. Morrison sat beside him, an imposing figure in an expensive suit, whispering in his client's ear. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and Judge Catherine Powell entered. Eleanor knew her by reputation, tough but fair, with no patience for theatrics. The choice of judge had been deliberate. The federal courts weren't taking any chances with this case. "United States versus Blake Miller," Judge Powell announced. "Mr. Miller, you are charged with deprivation of rights under color of law assault on a federal official and federal hate crime charges. How do you plead?" Miller stood, his voice barely audible. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The expected plea, but Eleanor noticed Miller couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Whatever bravado had carried him through that traffic stop had evaporated. Morrison immediately stood. "Your Honor, we move for bail. Mr. Miller is a decorated officer with no prior criminal record, with strong ties to the community. A decorated officer who assaulted a Supreme Court justice," Crawford interrupted. "The government opposes bail. The defendant poses a danger to the community, as evidenced by the 14 prior complaints." "Alleged complaints," Morrison shot back. "Unsubstantiated accusations that..." Judge Powell's gavel cracked. "Enough. Mr. Morrison, your client is charged with assaulting a member of the highest court in this land. The video evidence which I have reviewed is disturbing in its clarity. Bail is denied." Miller's shoulders sagged. As the guards prepared to lead him out, he suddenly turned toward Eleanor. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and she saw something unexpected: fear. Not just of prosecution or prison, but the dawning realization of what he had done, what he had become, what he had always been, but could no longer deny. "Justice Carter," he said, his voice cracking. Morrison grabbed his arm, trying to silence him, but Miller shook him off. I didn't know who you were." The courtroom went silent. Eleanor stood slowly, supporting herself on Michael's arm, and looked directly at him. "That's exactly the problem, Officer Miller. It shouldn't have mattered who I was." The guards led him away, but his words echoed in the silence. Morrison gathered his papers hastily, avoiding the glares from the gallery, and Eleanor knew he was already recalculating his strategy. The "I didn't know who you were" defense wouldn't play well to any jury. It was essentially an admission that he would have felt justified in his actions against anyone else. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to thousands. As Eleanor emerged, a roar went up that could probably be heard for blocks. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of faces, black and white and brown, young and old, all united in their demand for justice. A podium had been set up, and Crawford gestured for her to speak. Eleanor hadn't prepared remarks, but the words came anyway, pulled from some deep well of truth that transcended prepared speeches. "Officer Miller just said he didn't know who I was," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd through the microphone system. "He's right. He didn't know I was a Supreme Court justice. But he also didn't know if I was a teacher, a nurse, a mother, a grandmother, which I am. He didn't know if I was driving home from work, from church, from visiting my husband's grave, which I was. He didn't know anything about me except the color of my skin, and that was enough for him to decide I was a threat, a criminal, someone who deserved violence." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. "This case isn't about me. It's about what happens when we allow fear and prejudice to hide behind a badge. It's about what happens when we mistake authority for righteousness. It's about what happens when we forget that justice is not just a word we carve into courthouse facades, but a living principle that must be defended every single day." She paused, looking out at the faces turned up toward her, many with tears streaming down. I stand before you, bloodied but not broken. I stand before you as someone who has spent her life believing in the law, only to have the law turned against me. But I still believe I have to believe that we can do better, that we must do better, that we will do better. The applause was thunderous, but Eleanor was already moving exhausted by the performance of strength, when all she wanted was to go home and sleep. In the car, she leaned against Sarah's shoulder and closed her eyes. "You did good, Mom," Sarah whispered. "I haven't done anything yet," Eleanor replied. "The real fight is just beginning." Back at the house, Eleanor found an unexpected visitor waiting. Daniel Morrison himself, Miller's attorney. The federal agents had him under close watch, but he'd apparently convinced them he had legitimate business. "Justice Carter," he said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for seeing me." "I didn't agree to see you, Mr. Morrison. You're trespassing. Please, just 5 minutes. Not as Miller's attorney, but as—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words, as someone who's realizing they've been on the wrong side for too long. Eleanor studied him. Morrison was known for his aggressive defense of police officers, had made a fortune, arguing that every shooting was justified, every use of force was necessary. But something in his eyes looked different now, haunted maybe, or ashamed. "5 minutes," she said. Morrison sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "I've watched the videos 100 times. I keep looking for something, anything that would justify what Miller did. Some threatening gesture, some aggressive movement. There's nothing. You did everything right. Everything we tell people to do, and he still—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I have a daughter. She's about your age. I kept imagining if it had been her. But it wasn't," Eleanor said coldly. "And that's always been the problem, hasn't it? It's always someone else's mother, someone else's child, someone else's problem." Morrison nodded, accepting the rebuke. "Miller wants to change his plea. He wants to plead guilty." Eleanor felt no satisfaction at the words. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I wanted you to know that I see it now. What you said in court, that it shouldn't matter who you are. I've spent 20 years arguing the opposite, that context matters, that officers have to make split-second decisions based on limited information. But Miller had all the time in the world. He had you in handcuffs, subdued, compliant, and he still hit you. Because he could. Because he thought no one would care. And you've helped create a system where he was right to think that," Eleanor said. Morrison flinched, but didn't deny it. "I'm withdrawing from the case. I'll find Miller other representation, but I can't. I won't stand in court and argue that what he did was justified. I've done that too many times for too many officers who maybe didn't deserve my defense. I'm done." He stood to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, Justice Carter, I'm sorry. Not just for what happened to you, but for my part in creating a world where it could happen." After he left, Eleanor sat in stunned silence. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances, equally surprised by Morrison's confession. "Do you believe him?" Sarah asked. "I believe he's having a crisis of conscience," Eleanor replied. "Whether it lasts, whether it leads to real change, that remains to be seen." The evening brought more revelations. The FBI's investigation into the police department had already uncovered damning evidence. Officers had a WhatsApp group where they shared racist memes and celebrated aggressive arrests of minorities. Miller featured prominently, often boasting about his score, the number of black drivers he'd pulled over each month. Crawford called with updates. "We're looking at potential RICO charges. This wasn't just individual bad actors, it was an organized system of discrimination." Eleanor thought of Captain Russell, his shock at what had happened. Either he was complicit, or negligently ignorant. Neither option was acceptable for someone in his position. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked through her house, stopping at the wall of family photos. There was one of her and Marcus at a civil rights march in 1968, young and determined and full of hope. Another from her swearing in as a federal judge, Marcus beaming with pride beside her. Their wedding photo where they looked impossibly young and in love. She traced Marcus's face with her finger, wondering what he would make of all this. He'd always been the more radical one, the one who pushed for systemic change while she believed in working within the system. Maybe he'd been right all along. Maybe the system couldn't be reformed from within. Maybe it needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, then saw the preview. Justice Carter, I'm Officer Johnson, Miller's partner. I need to talk to you. Eleanor's heart raced. Johnson, who had stood by and done nothing while Miller assaulted her. She showed the message to the federal agents, who immediately traced the number and confirmed it was legitimate. Against their advice and her children's protests, Eleanor agreed to meet him. He arrived an hour later, a young officer barely out of his 20s, looking terrified. He was Latino, Eleanor realized, which added another layer to the complexity. I should have stopped him, Johnson said, without preamble, the words tumbling out like a confession. I knew Miller was out of control. I knew he targeted black drivers. But I was 3 months out of the academy. He was my training officer. I thought this was just how things were. Why didn't you report him? Eleanor asked. Johnson laughed bitterly. Report him to who? The sergeant who laughed at his stories, the captain who praised his arrest numbers, the union rep who said we always stick together. I tried once early on. Mentioned that maybe Miller was too aggressive. Next day, I found a dead rat in my locker. Message received. Eleanor felt a familiar anger building. The thin blue line wasn't just about loyalty. It was about intimidation, about enforcing silence through fear. I have recordings, Johnson said suddenly. Body cam footage I saved from other stops. Videos of Miller that were supposed to be deleted, but I kept copies. I was building a file trying to get enough evidence to go to the feds. I was too slow. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He was crying now, this young officer who'd been caught between his conscience and his survival. Eleanor felt an unexpected sympathy for him. He was a victim too, in his own way, of a system that corrupted everyone it touched. Give the recordings to the FBI, she said. Tell them everything, and then find another job, Mr. Johnson. You're not cut out for what that department has become. After Johnson left, Eleanor stood in her garden, breathing in the night air. The roses Marcus had planted were blooming, their scent heavy and sweet. She thought about systems and structures, about individual choices and institutional failures. Miller was just one officer, but he was produced by a system that enabled and encouraged his behavior. Removing him wouldn't solve the problem any more than removing a single weed would save a garden overrun with them. Her phone rang. It was Chief Justice Robertson. Eleanor, the president wants to meet with you. He's considering a major police reform initiative and wants your input. Eleanor almost laughed. Now they wanted her input. After she'd been bloodied and brutalized, now they wanted to hear what she had to say about police reform. Tell the president, she said slowly, that I'll meet with him after I've met with the families. The ones who've lost loved ones to police violence. The ones who've been fighting this fight for years without the platform I have. If he wants to talk about reform, he needs to hear from all of us, not just the Supreme Court justice who made the headlines. Robertson was quiet for a moment. I'll convey your message. Eleanor, you're changing things. Already departments across the country are reviewing their policies, their training procedures. Miller might have thought he was just pulling over another black driver, but he started a revolution. After the call, Eleanor sat in Marcus's study, surrounded by his law books and papers. She'd avoided this room since his death, the memories too painful. But tonight, she needed to feel his presence. On his desk was a legal pad with his handwriting notes for a case he'd never gotten to finish. The heading read, "The Persistence of Injustice: Why Legal Remedies Fail to Address Systemic Racism." Even from beyond, Marcus was still fighting, still pushing her to see the bigger picture. Eleanor picked up his pen and began to write, adding her own thoughts to his unfinished work. Together, even separated by death, they would continue the fight. The news continued to develop through the night. 3 more officers from Miller's department had been suspended pending investigation. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive review of police departments nationwide. Cities that had resisted reform were suddenly eager to implement changes, afraid of becoming the next headline. But Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. The anger would fade, the headlines would move on to other stories, and the pressure for reform would ease. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, in the slow, grinding work of changing laws and policies and hearts and minds. As dawn approached again, Eleanor finally slept, but her dreams were full of flashing lights and cold handcuffs and Miller's face as he raised his baton. She woke to find Sarah sitting beside her bed, keeping watch. "Bad dreams?" Sarah asked softly. "Memories," Eleanor corrected. "But also dreams. Dreams of what could be if we're brave enough to fight for it." Sarah took her mother's hand, and they sat in the early morning light, 2 generations bound by blood and purpose, and the unshakable belief that justice, though delayed and denied and deferred, would not be defeated, not while they still had breath to speak truth to power, not while they still had strength to stand against injustice, not while they still had hope that tomorrow could be better than today. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But Eleanor Carter, bloodied but unbroken, was ready for the battle ahead. The weeks that followed brought a parade of lawyers, investigators, and journalists through Eleanor's door. Each day revealed new layers of corruption within the department, like peeling back wallpaper to find rot in the walls beneath. The FBI had set up a mobile command center in the police station parking lot, a constant reminder that the federal government was watching now that the old ways of doing business were under scrutiny. Eleanor sat in her chambers at the Supreme Court for the first time since the assault, her colleagues having insisted she take whatever time she needed. But she couldn't stay away any longer. The law was her anchor, her purpose, and hiding felt like letting Miller win. The bandage was gone from her temple, now replaced by an angry red scar that her makeup artist couldn't quite conceal. "The president will see you at 2, her clerk James informed her. "He's cleared his entire afternoon." Eleanor nodded, reviewing the stack of cases that had accumulated in her absence. One caught her eye: Patterson v. City of Chicago, a police brutality case that had been working its way through the system for 3 years. The parallels to her own situation were stark, except Patterson hadn't survived his encounter. His widow was seeking justice through the only avenue left to her, the courts that had failed to protect her husband in life. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Chief Justice Robertson entered, followed by Justice Thompson and Justice Chen. They moved with the careful deliberation of people approaching something fragile. "Eleanor," Robertson began, "we need to discuss your recusal from certain cases." She'd been expecting this. "Any case involving police conduct, I assume, the appearance of bias," Thompson started, but Eleanor cut him off, "is unavoidable. I was assaulted by a police officer. That's not bias, Robert. That's experience. Should we recuse Justice Martinez from immigration cases, because she's the daughter of immigrants. Should you recuse yourself from death penalty cases because you were a prosecutor? Chen spoke gently. Eleanor, this is different. You're a victim in an ongoing federal case. Every black person in America is a victim of police bias, Eleanor replied. The only difference is that my victimization was caught on camera and made headlines. If anything, I'm now more qualified to evaluate these cases, not less. Robertson sighed. The motion for recusal in Patterson has already been filed. The defendant's attorneys are arguing that your recent experience makes it impossible for you to be impartial. Eleanor stood moving to her window that overlooked the Capitol. The building gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of democracy that felt increasingly hollow. Do you know what Marcus used to say, that the law is only as good as the people who enforce it? We can write the most perfect statutes, craft the most elegant opinions, but if the officers on the street believe they're above the law, none of it matters. That doesn't answer the recusal question, Thompson said. Eleanor turned back to face them. I will not recuse myself. If they want me off the case, they'll have to prove actual bias, not just the possibility of it. And I'd like to see them argue that being a victim of crime disqualifies someone from judging crimes. The meeting with President Harrison that afternoon was held in the Oval Office with an audience that included the Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, and several civil rights leaders Eleanor recognized from years of litigation. The president, a moderate Democrat, who'd appointed her to the court, looked older than she remembered, the weight of office etched in new lines around his eyes. Justice Carter, he began, standing to greet her. I want to first say how deeply sorry I am about what happened to you. It's unconscionable. With respect, Mr. President, I don't need apologies. I need action. Harrison nodded, gesturing for everyone to sit. That's why we're here. I'm announcing a comprehensive police reform package. Federal oversight of departments with patterns of discrimination, mandatory body cameras, an end to qualified immunity. It's not enough, Eleanor interrupted. The room fell silent, everyone staring at her. You're treating symptoms, not the disease. What would you have us do? The Attorney General asked, an edge of frustration in his voice. Eleanor pulled out a folder she'd prepared, thick with research and recommendations. Complete restructuring. Police academies that require 4-year degrees like every other profession that holds life and death in its hands. Psychological evaluations that screen for racial bias and authoritarian tendencies. Liability insurance for individual officers so bad cops price themselves out of the profession. Community oversight boards with actual power, not advisory committees that get ignored. That would take years to implement, Harrison said. The 13th Amendment took a war to implement, Eleanor replied. The Civil Rights Act took a movement. Real change is never convenient, Mr. President. The question is whether we have the courage to pursue it. One of the civil rights leaders, Reverend Jackson from Baltimore, spoke up. Justice Carter is right. We've been having this same conversation for decades. After Rodney King, after Ferguson, after George Floyd. Each time we get incremental changes that get rolled back the moment public attention shifts. We need transformation, not reformation. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Eleanor presenting case after case, statistic after statistic, building an argument as methodically as she would for the court. By the end, even the skeptics were taking notes. As she left the White House, her phone rang. It was Crawford, the prosecutor. Justice Carter Miller wants to meet with you face to face. His new attorney says he wants to apologize to try to make amends before sentencing. Eleanor stopped walking, causing her security detail to halt abruptly. Absolutely not. I told them you'd say that. But there's something else. Johnson's recordings, they're worse than we thought. There's video of Miller planting evidence during a drug stop 6 months ago. The man he framed is still in prison. Eleanor felt sick. How many others were there? How many lives had Miller destroyed before he'd made the mistake of stopping her? That evening, she found herself at Riverside Cemetery, standing before Marcus's grave. The roses she'd left on that fateful night had long since withered, replaced by fresh ones from Sarah. Eleanor knelt her hand on the cold granite. "I don't know if I can do this, Marcus," she whispered. "Everyone wants me to be strong, to be a symbol, to lead this fight. But I'm tired. I'm 78 years old, and I'm tired of fighting the same battles we fought when we were young." The wind rustled through the trees, and Eleanor could almost hear Marcus's voice. "Then fight differently. Use what happened to you to change how the fight is fought." She thought about that as she drove home, taking the same route she'd taken that night. When she passed the spot where Miller had pulled her over, she noticed a small memorial had been erected. Flowers, candles, signs reading "Justice for Justice Carter" and "Never Again." She pulled over, stepping out to read the messages people had left. One caught her eye, written in a child's careful handwriting. "Dear Justice Carter, my daddy got pulled over last week. The police officer was nice to him. He said it's because of what happened to you. Thank you for being brave. Love, Destiny, age 9. Eleanor carefully folded the note and put it in her pocket. This was why she couldn't give up. Not for herself, but for Destiny and all the children who deserved to grow up in a world where traffic stops didn't end in tragedy. Back home, she found Michael in Marcus's study going through old files. "Mom, look at this, Mom," he said, holding up a folder. Dad was working on a class action suit against the Baltimore Police Department. He had evidence going back 20 years, patterns of discrimination, excessive force complaints, the whole system. Eleanor took the folder, recognizing Marcus's meticulous notation system. He'd been building this case for years, gathering evidence that everyone said didn't exist or couldn't be proven. "He never filed it," Michael continued. "The last note is from a week before he got sick. He wrote, 'Waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst.'" Eleanor sank into Marcus's chair, overwhelmed by the feeling that he'd somehow known, somehow prepared for this moment even before his death. The case was thorough, comprehensive, exactly the kind of systemic challenge that could force real change. "We file it," she said. "Not just against Baltimore, but against every department showing the same patterns. We use Dad's framework and expand it. Make it nationwide." Michael nodded, already pulling out his phone to call his law partners. Sarah appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation. "The three of us," she asked, "taking on every corrupt police department in America." "Not just us," Eleanor said. "Every civil rights organization, every pro bono lawyer looking to make a difference, every citizen who's tired of living in fear. We create a coalition that can't be ignored." The next morning, Eleanor stood before the Supreme Court for oral arguments in Patterson versus City of Chicago. The defense attorney, predictably, immediately raised the recusal issue. "Your Honor, given recent events, we respectfully request that Justice Carter recuse herself from this case due to obvious bias." Eleanor leaned forward, her microphone crackling to life. "Counselor, are you arguing that personal experience with a subject disqualifies one from ruling on it? In this case, Your Honor, where you were yourself a victim. I've been a black woman in America for 78 years, Counselor. I've been pulled over for driving expensive cars in nice neighborhoods. I've been followed in stores despite being a federal judge. I've watched colleagues clutch their purses when I enter elevators. Should I recuse myself from all cases involving racial discrimination because I've experienced it?" The lawyer faltered. "That's different, Your Honor." "How?" Eleanor's voice was sharp now. Because this time there's video. Because this time the officer was arrested. The only difference between what happened to me and what happens to thousands of Americans every day is that I had the platform and resources to fight back. If anything, counselor by experience makes me more qualified to evaluate the facts of this case, not less. Chief Justice Robertson intervened. The motion for recusal is denied. Proceed with your arguments. The case itself was heartbreaking. Terrence Patterson, a 32-year-old teacher, had been shot during a traffic stop when he reached for his registration after being told to do so. The officer claimed he thought Patterson was reaching for a weapon. The dashcam video showed Patterson's hands clearly visible empty, except for the registration papers he'd been ordered to retrieve. Eleanor listened to the city's attorney argue that the officer had acted within department policy, that split-second decisions couldn't be judged with hindsight, that qualified immunity protected officers from such lawsuits. She thought of Miller raising his baton, the calculation in his eyes, the deliberate choice to inflict pain. When it came time for questions, Eleanor was ready. "Counselor," she began, "you argue that Officer Daniels acted within department policy. What exactly is that policy regarding shooting unarmed civilians?" "The policy allows for use of deadly force when an officer reasonably believes their life is in danger, Your Honor." "And what made Officer Daniels believe his life was in danger from a man complying with his direct orders?" "The furtive movement, Your Honor, the reaching motion. That he had ordered Mr. Patterson to make." Eleanor's voice was ice. "Are you arguing that following an officer's instructions is grounds for being shot?" The attorney stumbled through a response, but Eleanor had made her point. When the court retired to deliberate, the discussion was heated but brief. The ruling came down 7-2, with Eleanor writing the majority opinion that would reshape qualified immunity doctrine. "A badge is not a shield against accountability," she wrote. "When those entrusted with enforcing the law violate it, they must face the same justice system as any other citizen. To hold otherwise is to create a class of citizens above the law antithetical to everything this nation purports to represent." The decision sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Police unions condemned it as a war on cops, while civil rights organizations hailed it as long overdue progress. Eleanor received death threats which the FBI took seriously enough to triple her security detail. But she also received thousands of letters of support. Mothers thanking her for giving them hope that their sons might come home from traffic stops. Officers admitting they'd joined the force to help people but had been corrupted by the culture. Children sending drawings of her as a superhero, complete with judicial robes as a cape. Miller's trial was set for 3 months out, but the investigation had expanded far beyond him. 17 officers from his department had been indicted on various charges. Captain Russell had resigned in disgrace after emails surfaced, showing he'd known about and ignored patterns of discrimination. The entire command structure was being rebuilt under federal oversight. Eleanor attended every day of depositions even when she wasn't required to testify. She wanted to understand not just what had happened to her, but how someone like Miller had been created, enabled, protected by the system. During one deposition, a young officer broke down crying as he described the culture of the department. "They called it hunting season," he said through his tears. "Summer months when they'd compete to see who could make the most arrests in minority neighborhoods. Miller always won. They gave him a trophy once, a pair of handcuffs mounted on a plaque. It was displayed in the break room until last month." Eleanor listened to story after story, each one adding another layer to her understanding of how deep the rot went. It wasn't just individual bad actors. It was an entire culture that rewarded aggression, that saw certain communities as enemies rather than citizens to protect and serve. One evening, as she reviewed transcripts at home, Sarah brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "Mom, you're going to burn yourself out." You're trying to fix everything all at once." Eleanor set down the papers, looking at her daughter. "When I was your age, I thought we'd fixed this. The Civil Rights Act had passed, schools were integrated, we could vote without fear. I thought the hard work was done, that your generation would inherit a fair and just world." "You did make things better," Sarah said. "I grew up in a world you couldn't have imagined at my age." "But not good enough," Eleanor replied. "Not nearly good enough. And now I wonder if we were naive thinking we could legislate our way to equality. Laws only work when people choose to follow them, when the people enforcing them believe in them." Sarah took her mother's hand. "So what do we do? We keep fighting, but differently. Not just in courtrooms and legislatures, but in communities, in schools, in every interaction between police and citizens. We make Officer Miller's behavior so unacceptable that no one would dare repeat it, not because they fear prosecution, but because their own conscience wouldn't allow it." The next morning brought unexpected news. Daniel Morrison Miller's former attorney had announced he was closing his practice and starting a non-profit organization dedicated to prosecuting police misconduct cases. He'd pledged his entire fortune, millions earned defending corrupt cops, to fund it. He called Eleanor personally. "I can't undo the harm I've enabled," he said, "but I can try to prevent future harm. Would you consider serving on our advisory board?" Eleanor thought about it for a long moment. "On one condition. The first case you take is defending Jerome Washington, the man Miller framed with planted evidence. Pro bono." "Already done," Morrison replied. "We filed for his immediate release this morning." Small victories, Eleanor thought. Individual moments of redemption that might add up to real change. She thought of Miller sitting in his federal cell awaiting trial. She'd refused his request to meet, but she'd read the letter he'd sent through his attorney. It was rambling, self-pitying, more about his own suffering than acknowledgement of what he'd done. But there was one line that stuck with her: "I became something I never meant to be." The question was whether that was true, whether Miller had been corrupted by the system, or whether the system had simply revealed who he always was. Eleanor suspected it was both. The badge and gun had given him permission to act on his worst impulses, had rewarded him for behavior that should have been punished. Her phone rang. Crawford again. "Justice Carter, Jerome Washington has been released. He wants to meet you to thank you." "He doesn't owe me thanks," Eleanor said. "We owe him an apology. The entire system owes him years of his life back. He's insisting. Says he won't talk to the media until he's spoken with you." Eleanor agreed to meet him at a community center in Baltimore, away from the circus of cameras and reporters. Jerome Washington was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much, too soon. "Justice Carter," he said, his voice rough. "I watched your assault on the news from my cell. When I saw Miller hit you with that baton, I thought finally someone who can't be ignored, can't be dismissed, can't be forgotten. I'm sorry it took my assault for your case to come to light," Eleanor said. Jerome shook his head. "Don't apologize for surviving, for having power. Use it. My cousin, my brother, my friends, they all have stories. Most of them are too scared to tell them. But seeing you stand up, seeing Miller actually face consequences, it gives us hope." They talked for an hour, Jerome describing his arrest, the moment he realized Miller was planting drugs in his car, the helplessness of watching his life destroyed by someone who would later be called a decorated officer. Eleanor took notes, added his story to the growing file of cases that would form the basis of the nationwide class action suit. As she prepared to leave, Jerome asked, "Do you think things will really change, or will this all blow over once the cameras move on?" Eleanor thought of Marcus, of all the fights they'd fought, that seemed one only to resurface in new forms. "Change is slow," she said. "Sometimes it moves backward, but it does happen as long as people keep pushing for it. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it only bends toward justice when we pull it in that direction." That evening, Eleanor stood in her garden looking at the roses Marcus had planted. They were in full bloom now, their fragrance filling the air. She thought about cycles, about how things that seemed dead could bloom again with proper care and attention. Michael found her there. "Mom, the Times wants to do a feature. A year after the assault, where are we now kind of thing." "Tell them no," Eleanor said, then reconsidered. "Actually tell them yes, but only if they also profile Jerome Washington, Denise Williams, from the hospital, Officer Johnson, who came forward, and the families of everyone Miller arrested in the past 5 years. This isn't my story alone." As night fell, Eleanor went inside to her study, where Marcus's legal pad still sat, now filled with her additions to his notes. Together they'd built a framework for change that was already being implemented in 3 states. The Eleanor and Marcus Carter Foundation for Police Accountability was set to launch next month, funded by donations that had poured in from around the world. She looked at their wedding photo on the desk, 2 young law students who'd believed they could change the world. They'd been right, just not in the timeline they'd expected. Change came in generations, not years, in small victories that accumulated into transformation. The trial would start soon. Miller would likely be convicted, would serve time, would become a cautionary tale. But Eleanor knew the real victory wouldn't be in his punishment, but in the system changes his actions had sparked. Every officer who now thought twice before drawing their weapon, every department updating their training, every citizen who felt empowered to record and report misconduct, these were the ripples that would create waves. Tomorrow she would return to the Supreme Court to hear arguments in 3 more cases involving police conduct. She would carry her scar into that chamber, a visible reminder that justice was not an abstract concept, but a living principle that required constant vigilance to maintain. She would speak for those who couldn't speak, stand for those who'd been knocked down, fight for those who'd been silenced. The phone rang again, another reporter, another request for comment, another opportunity to keep the spotlight on the issues that mattered. Eleanor didn't answer. Tonight she would rest. Tomorrow the fight would continue. It always did. But for now, in the quiet of her home, surrounded by memories of Marcus and the love of her children, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The revolution hadn't started with her assault, and it wouldn't end with Miller's conviction. It was a continuous process, a daily choice to stand against injustice, to demand better, to believe that change was possible, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Eleanor Carter had become a symbol, but symbols only mattered if they inspired action. The morning of Blake Miller's trial arrived with unseasonable rain, as if the sky itself was weeping for all the injustices that had led to this moment. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror, carefully applying concealer to the scar that had become her unwanted badge of honor. No amount of makeup could fully hide it, and she'd stopped trying. Let them see it, she thought. Let everyone who looked at her remember what unchecked power could do. Sarah helped her into her chosen suit, not black, which would suggest mourning, but deep burgundy, the color of dried blood and determination. Michael waited downstairs with the federal agents reviewing the security protocols for what promised to be a circus of media attention and public emotion. "Ready?" Sarah asked, adjusting her mother's collar with gentle fingers. "I've been ready since the moment he raised that baton," Eleanor replied. The federal courthouse had been transformed into a fortress. Protesters lined the streets for 3 blocks in every direction, their chants creating a symphony of demand for justice. Counter-protesters had also gathered a smaller but vocal group holding back the blue signs and shouting about law and order. Between them stood rows of police in riot gear, the irony of their presence not lost on Eleanor as her motorcade passed through. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Eleanor recognized faces from every corner of her life, civil rights leaders she'd worked with for decades, judges she'd served alongside, families of police violence victims who'd reached out to her in solidarity. In the back row sat Officer Johnson Miller's former partner, his face drawn with the weight of his testimony to come. Miller entered in shackles, the orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. He'd lost weight in custody, his swagger replaced by something hollow and desperate. His new attorney, a public defender named Patricia Wells, who'd drawn the short straw of representing him after Morrison's withdrawal, looked resigned to fighting a losing battle. The prosecutor, James Crawford, had assembled a devastating case. 17 witnesses, including the bystanders from the Starbucks who'd filmed the assault. 43 pieces of video evidence from different angles. Medical records detailing Eleanor's injuries in clinical precision. And most damningly, Miller's own personnel file showing a pattern of complaints that should have ended his career years ago. The state calls Justice Eleanor Carter to the stand. Eleanor rose slowly, feeling every eye in the courtroom follow her movement. The walk to the witness stand felt both endless and too quick. She placed her hand on the Bible, the same one she'd used for her Supreme Court investiture, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Crawford's questions were gentle but thorough, walking her through that night with methodical precision. Eleanor kept her voice steady as she described the stop, the escalation, the moment Miller's baton connected with her skull. "Can you identify the man who assaulted you?" Crawford asked. Eleanor looked directly at Miller for the first time since the arraignment. He couldn't meet her gaze, staring instead at his cuffed hands. "Officer Blake Miller," she said clearly, sitting at the defendant's table. The cross-examination by Wells was uncomfortable but predictable. She tried to suggest Eleanor had been uncooperative, that she'd used her position to intimidate a young officer just doing his job. "Justice Carter, isn't it true that you immediately identified yourself as a Supreme Court justice?" "I identified myself as a federal judge, yes, just as I provided my driver's license and registration when asked." "And didn't you think that mentioning your position might be seen as an attempt to avoid a lawful stop?" Eleanor's voice remained calm. "Ms. Wells, I stated a fact. I am a Supreme Court justice. That's not a threat or an attempt at manipulation, it's simply who I am. Should I have lied, pretended to be someone else to make Officer Miller more comfortable with his illegal actions?" Wells tried another angle. "You were driving from a cemetery late at night. Could Officer Miller have reasonably suspected that a 78-year-old woman driving the speed limit in a Lincoln town car was what exactly?" Eleanor interrupted. "A drug dealer, a gang member, or was my crime simply existing while black in a neighborhood where Officer Miller didn't think I belonged?" The questioning continued for 2 hours, Wells desperately searching for some crack in Eleanor's testimony, some contradiction or embellishment. But Eleanor had spent 50 years in courtrooms. She knew how to testify, how to remain composed under pressure, how to let the facts speak louder than emotions. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, Eleanor caught Jerome Washington's eye in the gallery. He nodded once, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. They were part of the same fraternity, now survivors of Miller's particular brand of justice. The parade of witnesses that followed painted a damning picture. Jasmine Porter, the young woman from Starbucks, broke down crying as she described watching Miller strike Eleanor. "She wasn't resisting," Jasmine sobbed. "She was just standing there, this elderly woman in handcuffs, and he hit her like she was nothing, like she wasn't even human." The security footage from nearby businesses was played showing angles that hadn't been seen publicly before. The courtroom gasped collectively when one video clearly showed Miller laughing as he dragged Eleanor to his cruiser, blood streaming down her face. Officer Johnson's testimony was perhaps the most devastating. Under oath, he revealed years of witnessing Miller's behavior, the department's culture that enabled it, the intimidation faced by anyone who tried to speak up. "I found a note in my locker once," Johnson said, his voice barely above a whisper. It said, "Snitches get stitches." There was a photo of my mother's house attached. I got the message. Crawford introduced the evidence. Johnson had secretly recorded body cam footage of Miller planting drugs, bragging about hunting black drivers, teaching rookie cops how to escalate situations to justify arrests. "Listen to this recording from 6 months ago," Crawford said, playing audio from Johnson's hidden recorder. Miller's voice filled the courtroom. "The trick is to make them angry. Get in their space talk down to them. Eventually they'll react and boom, resisting arrest. Works every time on these people." Eleanor watched Miller shrink further into his chair with each piece of evidence. His attorney had stopped objecting, apparently recognizing the futility of fighting the avalanche of proof. On the second day of trial, something unexpected happened. Captain Russell, who'd been subpoenaed as a hostile witness, broke down on the stand. "I knew," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "God help me, I knew what Miller was. I saw the complaints, saw the patterns. But the union protected him, the city didn't want lawsuits, and I was a coward. I told myself I was picking my battles, waiting for the right moment to act. But the truth is, I was comfortable. It was easier to look the other way." "How many complaints against Officer Miller did you personally review?" Crawford asked. "All of them. 14 formal complaints, probably dozens more informal ones that never got filed because people knew nothing would happen." "And what action did you take?" Russell's voice was barely audible. "I required him to attend 2 sensitivity training sessions. That's it. That's all I did, while he terrorized an entire community." Eleanor felt no satisfaction watching Russell's confession. His tears were too late for Jerome Washington's lost years, for all the unnamed victims who'd suffered under Miller's badge. But perhaps his testimony would prevent future Captain Russells from choosing comfort over conscience. The defense's case was brief and desperate. Wells called character witnesses fellow officers who praised Miller's arrest record while carefully avoiding mention of his methods. She introduced Miller's commendations and awards as if pieces of metal could outweigh the video evidence of brutality. Miller himself took the stand on day 3 against his attorney's advice. He'd clearly been coached, trying to appear remorseful, but his true nature kept breaking through. "I was following my training," he insisted. "When someone challenges your authority, you have to maintain control of the situation." "By striking an elderly woman who was already in handcuffs?" Crawford asked during cross-examination. She was undermining my authority, claiming to be someone important. I thought she was lying, trying to intimidate me." "So you hit her?" Miller's facade cracked. "She needed to learn respect for the badge." The courtroom erupted. Judge Powell hammered her gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the gallery. Eleanor remained perfectly still, watching Miller reveal himself for what he truly was, a man who'd confused fear with respect, power with authority, brutality with strength. Crawford continued his dissection. "Officer Miller, how many black drivers did you stop in the month before arresting Justice Carter?" "I don't see color," Miller said, a response so rehearsed it sounded robotic. "The records show 93 traffic stops that month. 87 were black drivers. Can you explain that statistical anomaly? I patrol high-crime areas. The area where you stopped Justice Carter has one of the lowest crime rates in the county," Crawford interrupted. "Try again." Miller's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Every excuse Miller offered only dug his hole deeper. During a recess, Eleanor found herself in the bathroom with Denise Williams, the woman from the hospital, whose son was also named Marcus. Denise was crying, but they were tears of something closer to relief than sadness. "He's going down," Denise said. "Miller's actually going to prison. I never thought I'd see a cop held accountable." "One cop," Eleanor reminded her gently. "There's still work to do. But it's a start, right? If someone like Miller can't get away with it anymore, maybe the others will think twice." Eleanor hoped she was right, but she'd lived long enough to know that systemic change required more than individual accountability. Still, she squeezed Denise's hand in solidarity. "It's a start," she agreed. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Wells tried valiantly to paint Miller as a dedicated officer who'd made a single mistake in judgment, whose lifetime of service shouldn't be destroyed by one incident. Crawford's response was devastating in its simplicity. He played the video of Miller striking Eleanor one more time, then faced the jury. "That's not a mistake. That's not a judgment call. That's assault. If anyone else in this courtroom had done that to Justice Carter, or to anyone, they'd be sitting where Miller sits now. The badge doesn't grant immunity from basic human decency." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Eleanor waited in a witness room with her children, the time crawling by despite the relative speed of the verdict. When the bailiff finally called them back, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault on a federal official, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of committing a federal hate crime, we find the defendant guilty." Eleanor felt no joy at the verdicts, only a hollow sense of completion. Miller's shoulders shook as he sobbed, finally understanding that his actions had consequences. His attorney requested bail pending sentencing, which Judge Powell denied with barely concealed disgust. As the guards led Miller away, he turned one last time toward Eleanor. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and she saw something that might have been genuine remorse or might have just been self-pity. She would never know which, and found she didn't care. Miller had become something more than just a bad cop. He'd become a symbol of everything wrong with the system. His conviction was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to thousands. When Eleanor emerged, flanked by her children and security detail, a roar went up that could probably be heard for miles. She stood at the microphones that had been set up, looking out at the sea of faces, black and white and brown, young and old, all united in this moment of accountability. Today, one man was held responsible for his actions. She began, her voice carrying across the crowd. But Blake Miller is not an aberration. He's a product of a system that teaches officers to see certain communities as enemies rather than citizens, that values arrest statistics over human dignity, that protects bad actors at the expense of public trust. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The prepared remarks she'd written seemed inadequate now faced with the raw hope in the crowd's eyes. This verdict doesn't bring back the years Jerome Washington lost to false imprisonment. It doesn't heal the trauma of everyone Miller terrorized with impunity. It doesn't fix the system that created him. But it sends a message: no one is above accountability. No one is beneath justice. The crowd erupted in applause, but Eleanor wasn't finished. The real work starts now. Miller will go to prison, but what about the culture that enabled him? What about the supervisors who ignored complaints? What about the union representatives who protected him? What about the city officials who prioritized avoiding lawsuits over protecting citizens? She looked directly into the cameras, knowing her words would be broadcast nationwide. I call on every police department in America to look at their own ranks. How many Blake Millers are you harboring? How many complaints are you ignoring? How many citizens are you failing to protect? This verdict isn't an ending. It's a beginning. The beginning of accountability. The beginning of change. The beginning of the America we claim to be, but have never quite become. As she walked back to her car, people reached out to touch her, to thank her, to share their own stories of survival and injustice. Eleanor listened to as many as she could, each story strengthening her resolve to continue the fight. That evening, Eleanor sat in her study with Michael and Sarah, surrounded by legal documents for the nationwide class action suit they were preparing. The conviction of Blake Miller had opened doors, given credibility to claims that would have been dismissed before. Police departments across the country were scrambling to review their policies, their personnel, their practices. "Mom," Sarah said, looking up from her laptop, "Miller's been placed in protective custody. Apparently, the other inmates know who he is, what he did." Eleanor felt no satisfaction at this news. Prison violence wouldn't undo the harm Miller had caused or reform the system that had created him. If anything, it would only perpetuate the cycle of brutality that needed to be broken. "I want to ensure he's safe," Eleanor said, surprising her children. "He's been convicted, he'll serve his time. But if we celebrate violence against him, we're no better than he was." Michael looked at his mother with renewed admiration. Even after everything, she maintained her principles, her belief in justice over vengeance. The phone rang, Chief Justice Robertson calling with news from Washington. "Eleanor, Congress is moving forward with the Justice Carter Act, national police reform legislation. Mandatory body cameras, federal oversight of departments with patterns of discrimination, an end to qualified immunity. The president wants you there when he signs it." Eleanor thought of Marcus, how he would have loved to see this moment. Real substantive change encoded into law, not just promises or platitudes. "Tell the president I'll be there," she said. "But I want the families there too. Jerome Washington, the Pattersons, all of them. This isn't my law, it's theirs." After Robertson hung up, Eleanor walked to her window, looking out at the garden, where Marcus's roses bloomed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of justice, not the black and white of legal briefs, but the complex grays and brilliant colors of real life, messy and imperfect, but always striving towards something better. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine Porter, the young woman who'd filmed the assault. "Thank you for showing us that fighting back is possible. My little sister wants to be a lawyer now. She says she wants to be like you." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile since that night months ago. This was how change really happened, not just through verdicts and legislation, but through inspiration, through showing the next generation that justice was possible if you were willing to fight for it. She thought about Miller sitting in his cell, forced to confront what he'd become. She wondered if he would use his time to genuinely reflect and reform, or if he would emerge even more bitter and hateful. That was his choice to make. But his ability to harm others had been ended, and that was what mattered. Tomorrow there would be more battles, more cases to hear, more testimonies, to give more fights for justice in a system still struggling to live up to its ideals. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not celebration, there was too much work left for that, but acknowledgement that sometimes, against all odds, justice could prevail. She picked up Marcus's legal pad, now filled with notes for the class action suit, and added one more line: "Today, accountability. Tomorrow, transformation." The revolution hadn't been televised. It had been live-streamed, recorded on cell phones, preserved in court transcripts. And it would continue, one case at a time, one victory at a time, one changed heart at a time, until the promise of equal justice under law became reality for all Americans, not just those privileged enough to survive their encounters with those sworn to protect and serve.